So then if
Rahel,
you're
back to you.
back to me, and if you are both asking for the same, and there is conversation both about charters and the idea of what Hamas's charter says, I want to actually bring it back to the question at hand. We received a lot of questions about what Hamas perpetrated on October 7th. We received a tremendous amount of questions that actually had to do with the gender-based violence on October 7th. Before we get to the gender-based violence, something that Dr. Maté, I think that you had actually referenced with regard to years earlier with gender-based violence coming the other way. I want to really be able to narrow down the question that I asked. Whether you agree with the charter of Hamas or not, is Hamas, the way that they acted on October 7th, the gender-based violence, the violence in general, the concept of a terrorist attack to begin with, the taking of hostages that are still being held to this day, do you believe that Hamas's goals and what they did are doing damage to the Palestinian people? Is Hamas really the true representative of the Palestinian people? And how do we navigate that? And I'd like you to speak to that specifically. And I don't remember whose turn it is. So I'm happy to go to Rabbi Wolpe. You want to start, or Dr. Maté?
No, it's Dr. Wolpe's turn, actually. Oh, sorry, Rabbi Wolpe.
Okay, that's all right. I mean, yeah, I do think that Hamas is doing tremendous damage to the Palestinian cause in many, many different ways. And I think that there are many Palestinians who believe that, but most of them are afraid to say so for obvious reasons, because it is ill-advised to oppose a regime that came into power in part by eliminating its rivals. And second, I think that, yeah, the testimony of gender-based violence, which was extensive and gruesome, and even I spoke to people in Israel whose family members had been victims of gender-based violence, was not only awful, but it was, the awfulness of it was compounded by the slowness of official groups to acknowledge it, like the United Nations, despite the fact that the evidence was manifest, and then by deniers online who claim that no, such violence never happened, which I have to say, I take Dr. Maté's point about how people tend very quickly to go to themselves and to their people as victims. But in this particular case, I cannot imagine for a moment that there would be a denial of such explicit testimony for any other group in the world other than Israelis and Jews. And it's, for me, somewhere between disgusting and nauseating that that's so.
All right. Rachel, I'm going to ask you, Rahel, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you to repeat the question, okay? So that I can really answer it.
The question actually focused on the original question that I had asked with regard to Hamas. Yeah. Right. If we are looking, you both talked about Hamas's charter. We talked about Likud charter, and we talked around the issue. But I want to actually get to this particular question, which is Hamas doing tremendous damage as representatives right now of the Palestinian people in Gaza? We know that there was testimony of gender-based violence on October 7th. There has been much that has been written, whether in investigative form or by way of actual testimony of whether it's first responders or whether it is people that actually heard and saw what was happening. I myself sat in the UN and heard testimony. And I say that in asking the question of what Hamas did on October 7th, are they really acting in the best interest and as the right representatives of the Palestinian people, or are they doing more damage than good?
All right. Let me give you a short answer and then a longer one. On October the 7th, my response, as my two sons could tell you, was that Hamas committed a crime, that what Hamas did was criminal, And furthermore, it was an act of criminal stupidity, because I knew the brutality of the Israeli response. Having seen Israel massacre thousands of Palestinians before, I knew exactly what was going to happen. None of this struck me as a surprise. I'm still horrified every day what we're seeing in Gaza today by what Jewish Holocaust experts have said is near genocide or genocide. But I knew it was going to come. So I thought first it was a criminal act, and it was. It was an atrocity. There's no question here. Number one. Number two, I very much feared what's going to happen to the Gazan population as a result, knowing how unfettered and brutal the Israel response has been for decades and decades and decades and decades. So that's the short answer. Okay. Now the long answer is somewhat different, which is that the very framing of the question is rather typical of the conversations that are being held around this issue. Nobody ever asks, how should we respond to Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians for the last 75 years? Nobody ever asks, how should Hamas respond to the IDF that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians? Nobody ever asks, how should the Palestinians respond to the hundreds of deaths in the West Bank that has occurred this year at the hands of the army and at the hands of the settlers, including the deaths of children, as documented again by Israeli journalists? Those questions are not raised. The questions are always, how to respond to Hamas? Well, that's a fair question, but there's an equally fair question that's never asked, which is how should Hamas and the Palestinians in general respond to Israel and to the historical expulsion and mass killings? Now, October 7th was not the first massacre in or near Gaza. In 1953, the Israelis massacred Palestinians in Gaza. In 1956, again they did. One of the founders of Hamas, and again, I'm not here as a spokesperson or any kind of an apologist. I'm just saying the facts. There was an 8-year-old boy who watched his uncle being killed by the Israelis in a massacre of civilians that was again documented by Israeli historians. He then becomes the first leader of Hamas. He became a pediatrician, and he said, I couldn't sleep for many months after I saw my uncle being killed. It left a wound in my heart that can never heal. I'm telling you a story and I'm almost crying. This sort of action can never be forgotten. They planted hate in our hearts. There was a lot of hatred, vicious hatred, that went into what happened on October the 7th. Where did it come from? 50 years ago, Hamas didn't even exist. Now, in terms of the history of Hamas and Gaza, I just ask you to consult the sources. Hamas won. Again, I'm not here to apologize. I'm just telling you what happened. There was a free election held in Palestine, I think 2005 or 2003, which, according to international observers, including the Jimmy Carter Center, was the freest election ever held in any Arab country. Hamas happened to win. Why did they win? Because by that time, the PLO had totally discredited itself as corrupt, as oppressive, and as a handmaiden to the Israeli occupation. So the Palestinians chose this militant group, and then Israel and the United States tried to support the PLO in displacing Hamas, and Hamas defeated them. And then Gaza was put on this blockade. So I'm saying, without going into all the details, and I could speak for 4 hours here, I'm just telling you, there's a whole different view of history and what happened there and where Hamas came from. Now, is Hamas the right leadership for Israel, for the Palestinians? I ask, why don't we asking, is Likud the right leadership for the Jews or for Israel? Because it's the Jews' right to decide who their leaders should be. And Israel's right to select governments, even if those governments include openly fascistic elements, like the current one does. Why aren't we asking the opposite? All I'm saying is, let's apply the same standard to both sides.
Rabbi Wolpe, what is your response to that?
My response to that is, first of all, that's a question that is asked every single day in Israel, because in Israel there is a free press, and in Israel there is a democratic process. What we haven't heard is that that was the last election. That may have been a free election, but it was also the last one. After that, neither Hamas nor the PA ever put themselves up for election again. And by the way, just not to elide the history so much, many PA officials were executed by Hamas when they contested the election, because once Hamas is in power, it's not going to be dispossessed. Benjamin Netanyahu will be out of power when he's voted out of power. And I think that that should happen soon, and probably will happen soon. But there are democratic elections in Israel. That is not true in most of the Arab world, unfortunately. And there isn't a very developed political culture there. And it's quite remarkable that there is in Israel, because the vast majority of people in Israel came from dictatorships and from autocracies and totalitarian regimes, and yet managed to establish a democracy. And I wish in this, at least, they would influence the nations around them to do the same.
I'd like to respond very briefly, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, the Arab world is largely dictatorial, run by oligarchies and dictatorships, which are supported by the United States. There were free elections in Egypt. Somebody won. An American-supported coup overthrew them. After Hamas won the election in the occupied territories, Hillary Clinton said, if we're going to run elections, we should have made sure that the right people are going to win. That's the American attitude towards election. Look at any number of elections around the world that the Americans have subverted or overly overthrown by coups when they don't like the results. Number one. Number two, it's very difficult. Secondly, Israel is not a democracy. It's what the Israeli historian Shlomo Sant has called an ethnocracy. It's designed to ensure the rule of a certain ethnic group. There's no democracy for the Palestinians living under occupation, whose lands are grabbed every day, whose children are jailed every day, who are tortured every day. Do you know that according to a New York Times report a few months ago, Palestinians whose homes are destroyed by settlers, when they come back to their homes, they don't have the right to even put a tarp over their living room to protect the rain from coming in, because that would be construction without permit, and their home could be bulldozed by the Israeli army. Don't believe me, read the New York Times. So under those conditions, it's extraordinarily difficult to have elections. This is a people under siege, under occupation, under daily brutality. And when we talk about the hostages, how about the thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli jails for the crime of opposing the illegal occupation of their country? How about the children that are being beaten and tortured in Israeli jails? How about that? Do we ever talk about that? I'm only asking again. And then we say that they don't have free elections. But no, they don't. We don't let them. We don't create the permissions for them to live in conditions where democracy is even possible. That's just how it is. And by the way, who supports and uses the manipulative, corrupt Palestinian Authority? Israel. And by the way, who supported Hamas? This is not even controversial. Netanyahu did. Israel did, because they wanted somebody there with whom they wouldn't have to negotiate. That's just how it is. Again, I don't make this stuff up. I don't make this stuff up.
So Rabbi Wolpe, I turn it back over to you.
Two very quick responses. First of all, in terms of which elections America supports or doesn't, the discussion about American foreign policy, I think, should be a different Zoom. Let's bracket that for a moment. I don't want to discuss Hillary Clinton's choices of words. But on the second point, actually, it's an ethnocracy because there's a mixed population. You know, there are over 1 million Arabs who live in Israel and choose to live in Israel and serve, some in the army, on the Supreme Court, in the Knesset, in other countries around there, including, I mean, in the West Bank and Gaza, but that goes without saying, in other countries around there, the reason that that isn't an issue is because there are no Jews or Christians in them, because they have long since purged any other elements. And so when we're talking about a group that is willing actually to, the only Christians that live in the Middle East now are Christians that live in Jerusalem, in Israel, because except maybe a few still left in Lebanon, but those are also being gradually pushed out of Lebanon by Hezbollah and Iran, who is behind this. And we haven't even talked about Iran, even though so much of this is about Iran. But I just want to say also, I was in Israel in 2002, after the second Intifada, after there were 150 suicide bombings on buses, in cafes, aimed always at civilians, always, not at soldiers, at people. I went into I'm trying to remember the name of it begins with an S, cafe, where they were having a Seder, and I saw the knives and forks in the ceiling from the force of the suicide bombs. So let's not make this into, the Israelis are doing all these awful things and then sitting back in their chairs and smoking their cigars and, and petting their dogs in their smoking jackets. It doesn't work that way. In fact, they have on their border people who have in the past shown that they will do anything, including attack Jewish sites outside of Israel, synagogues, restaurants, other Jews and Jewish sites. So this is not such a simple victimization, oppressor narrative, as I think some people may believe from listening to my distinguished interlocutor.